So Wilfred, I probably should call you Professor Reilly out of the gate, shouldn't I? Thank you so much for doing this with me. Yeah, I know you're doing a lot of this kind of thing, and it's important that you're getting out the things that you have to say right now. We live in I guess, is it a cultural moment? Can we say that to me as an outsider, as you can tell from my accent, is strange. It's confusing. I can't translate it to my native land of the UK. And although I'm long naturalized now as an American citizen, the identity politics here, and especially the racial identity politics, is something that I find it hard to relate to. So I'm just going to put that out there at the beginning. Now, I'm very interested in communication across kind of gaps of distrust and ideological division. But from what I know of your work, Wilfred, I don't think we have that. I mean, a lot of what I hear you say or read you write seems to just make sense. So I'll put that out there right now. But maybe you can help me understand this space that you operate in. I'm going to start, if I may, by saying to you something that a good friend put to me. And actually, this is the friend that first reached out to you to invite you to speak to me here today. And that is this, which actually seems quite sensible to me. I think I can buy this. He says, it's impossible being born and bred in America and not in some way being racist, because representations of white people and Black people are just so different from, as soon as you're watching the TV or listening to podcasts or whatever it is, you're seeing Black people and white people presented differently. You're going to feel at a very base level that there's something there. And he says it can't not affect you. So let's just start with that. Is every American in some subtle way inherently racist, which is a claim that many people make?
No. Yeah, I think language like this is absolutely meaningless. I mean, so first of all, the extreme and theological definition of words, I think, is a problem. I don't think that you are a racist if you have ever had a negative thought about, for example, Caucasians coming from, say, the Black middle class in the USA. And this goes on. I don't think you're a rapist if you have sex with someone after, 3 drinks, according to most college statutes. I mean, that's most second dates. I don't think you're a pedophile if you find junior college cheerleaders attractive. I mean, I think there's this.
Oh, you're destroying it here, Wilfred, already.
Oh, well, good to know. But I mean, I think there's this tendency in sort of debate culture, and the Brits definitely have this too. I mean, when you look at, Milo Yiannopoulos and some of these guys that have come out of that British sort of debating society world saying, crazy things, but very eloquently. I mean, but there's a tendency to focus on the very technically accurate. I debated abortion once. I'm in the debate world myself, of course, but I debated abortion once, and someone said, well, would you concede that single-celled organisms are alive, according to the 65% majority of biologists today? And I said, no, sure. And would you concede that, a fetus contains human DNA? Sure. And the guy jumped up at the podium and screamed, then it's a human life. And this is what I mean. I mean, it technically, in some sense, maybe. Is this a person after 3 days following conception? It's the same thing with this. I mean, so I guess the point I'm getting to is that there's generally been a very consistent definition of racism used in actual quantitative political science, which could be summed up as, do you dislike Blacks or whites or whatever one? And is that for genetic reasons too? So we generally test this with sort of ordinal scales. I mean, you're not going to walk up to a guy and ask him, are you a bigot who no longer wants to be employed? These aren't always even anonymous surveys. So what you would ask is, would you be willing to date a highly attractive person of a racial group you consider perhaps to be a rival? Would you be willing to work for a Black boss or a white one? Would you be willing to live next to an intimate neighbor of a different racial group? And when we actually do a test for racism, I mean, right now it seems like about 10% of whites and Blacks test as bigots. So I don't think that seeing that there are, white people are presented as corrupt businessmen on television or something like that, and perhaps believing this in some tiny corner of your mind, no, I don't think that makes you a racist. There's a difference between imperfection and actual racism or sexual assault. Many of these things are against the law. I mean, violence, speech is not violence. So no, I would disagree with that. as a final sentence, I don't know that the media does go out of its way to present certainly blacks in a negative light. I mean, looking at advertisements recently, I was surprised to find that about 50% of the people on US daytime broadcasts in the ads are black. I mean, there aren't that many Hispanics or Asians, but I mean, we're certainly presented constantly in the media in a positive light as these large US, or for that matter, UK and French and so on corporations try to be woke, try to avoid this specter of being labeled as bigots. So no, I don't really think that's true in any meaningful sense. I think having one black or white or whatever girlfriend would remove that tiny level of prejudice you get from the daily papers and that sort of thing.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So is it fair to say this? So my friend is that I was talking about there, Paul. He's older than I am, so he's an older Gen Xer. So while we might grant that, let's say today, people of your skin hue are positively and perhaps even overrepresented in the media, when he was, say, a child or a teenager, or even in his 20s, maybe the opposite was true. And that might have some consequence in the behaviors, conscious or subconscious, of people who now, being in their 40s, 50s, 60s, hold positions of power in commerce or in state agencies, whatever it may be. Is that rubbish? Is there anything potentially in that?
Well, you can never know what's in, another man's soul. But I mean, I tend to think people often forget how long ago the old racial conflicts were. I mean, I'm in my mid to late 30s, and I grew up like listening to Tupac and Nirvana. I mean, my first high school girlfriend was Caucasian. Like nobody remembered that world. And this was 20 years in the past. So, I mean, it's worth noting that the Brown v. Board decision, which completely desegregated US schools, this applied primarily in the North and took place in 1954. I'm not saying that even in the 70s or something, there weren't holdovers of this, clashes in the street and so on, but I mean, that's a long time ago. We beat the Nazis in 1945 when you're talking about the US or the UK. So, I mean, I don't actually think that living as, let's say, a Black person in the middle class in the urban North, because that's everyone attending Harvard and so on, I don't think you would have experienced, nightmarish racism for the past 60, 70 years. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable comment to make. You would have to convince me. There was a great deal of this a decade after the Civil Rights Bill. We've had pro-minority affirmative action here in the States, positive discrimination since 1967. So I don't even stoutly oppose that. I mean, in the private sector, that's your company, that's your firm. But I mean, it's a bit silly. I hear very often Black businessmen, which for obvious reasons are a large percentage of my friends, saying things like, man, I don't know. My white wife doesn't understand the disadvantage I'm applying for this job. And it's like, my guy, there's literally a program that's going to hire 11% Blacks for this job. Like there's not a disadvantage that you're facing. It's totally fair to say there might be if you're stopped by the police or something like that. But this is one of the points of my writing. Like, it's pretty easy to break this down. What's the effect of performative action at top colleges? It's more than 100 points. I mean, so we know what the actual facts are. And no, I don't think that for decades, to put it like this, it's been especially difficult to be an Asian or a middle-class Black or a Jew or anything like this in the United States. I mean, there's some outliers. I wouldn't have wanted to be gay in the urban USA in the 90s. But that would be in part because Black people and ethnic white people would beat me up. It wouldn't be because there would be some systemic bias against even me.
Okay, so you mentioned the racism as a term, and that we have to be careful with language, which I'm really glad that you mentioned, because I wanted to go there. It's kind of at the top of my list thing to discuss. Kind of there's like a paradigmatic issue, it seems to me here. And again, I'm kind of an observer watching people like you debate other folks. And one thing I think I might be seeing across the board is a redefinition of highly loaded terms. So racism is one, privilege is another, such that people who would claim to disagree with you, Wilfred, get to keep using these terms that have connotations of intent or immorality to describe things that actually don't entail intent or immorality at all. And it kind of keeps this on a kind of a moral burner, like this kind of moral outrage. Now, if that's true, then that's a really, really big deal, right? I mean, is really important language getting, as I say, redefined in front of our eyes and ears? And if so, is that being done with any sincerity? And if it isn't, what should we start doing about it? Like, why aren't we outraged?
So there are a couple of great questions there. First, absolutely, language is being redefined. I mean, I don't want to be crude or insult women, but I mean, I use the example of sexual assault because I'm a college prof and I've read some of these speech codes. Quite bluntly, if you redefine rape to include sex while you're drunk, you're going to have more rapes. And I mean, most studies that find that, for example, 1 in 2 women is abused while they're in college are very specifically asking about this. I mean, a common version of the question would be, have you had sex after more than 2 or 3 alcoholic drinks, or that you weren't enthusiastic about after a day of work? I think it'd be interesting to give those 2 questions to men, by the way, in terms of that bar and pub culture. I mean, how many guys would have gone home with someone and then regretted this and gone and taken a test and so on? But I mean, without it all mocking, that is going to change the numbers that you get. The FBI in the USA actually redefined sexual assault to include what you could crudely call fingering a couple of years ago, and you saw sexual assault surge by 40,000. Racism, of course, is by no means as serious as rape or domestic violence, although it's often treated as such. But I mean, yeah, you're seeing the same thing. I mean, when someone like, and this is an excellent point you're making, when someone like Dr. Ibram Kendi, for example, nothing against the man intellectually, and the bit of sparring online, but not very much, honestly. He generally doesn't respond. Some interesting books. But I mean, his actual definitions, when you get into the core of what he's saying, are very troubling to me. Because, I mean, his definition of racism would be any system that produces a disparate outcome across racial groups. He's very openly said this in major, one-on-one interviews with Vox and publications like this. And the argument he would make is not actually entirely incoherent, but it's the only 2 options when you see a big gap between groups are genetic inferiority or racism. The problem is that this is not true. It simply skips over an entire paradigm called quantitative culturalism when you think of Tom Sowell and Amy Chua and so on. So, I mean, for example, I'm not going to go into, my potential upcoming book about this, but why give these concepts away for free? But in all seriousness, most of them are in the last book. I'm joking. But I mean, like when you take a very simple example, the most common age, not the fully average age, the most common age for a black man is 27, white man is 58. So when you say, well, blacks have lower income on average or less wealth on average, or to flip this a little bit, a higher crime rate on average, or we're better athletes or something like that, you have to adjust for the fact that there's a decade plus difference here. I mean, if you don't do that and don't cut that initial gap in half, as you very often see, you're just being dishonest as a scholar. So in reality, there's a very simple reply to Mr. Kendi, Dr. Kendi. But whether or not you agree with the guy or not, one of the things you have to notice is that the semantic point you made, that's not even in dispute. When he says racism, he doesn't mean whites or blacks or whatever disliking the other man or engaging in discrimination or any conventional definition of racism. He simply means that any system, no matter how neutral, that produces a disparate outcome is racist. And this is what people mean when you use terms like environmental racism. What they mean is that more blacks or Hispanics or perhaps poor whites live near dump sites. It's not that anyone put the dump sites there to target those 3, in fact, very distinct groups. It's simply that working class neighborhoods are closer to dump sites on average. So these terms can be almost meaningless. Environmental racism is you live in a poorer environment if you live in a poorer part of town. Test bias or implicit testing racism is simply there are gaps on the SAT, the ACT, and the GRE. That's all this means. And again, when you take a serious culturalist quantitative scholar and have them take a look at this, they start pointing things out. Like the group that actually has the highest overall set of scores on the major American aptitude test is Asian Americans. And that's a group that, except for Black Americans, has probably suffered more than any other here. If you look at the history of Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, the one exception might be natives, of course, as versus Asians or Blacks. But I mean, that's absolutely inconsistent with the idea that these gaps are reflective of some kind of hidden white supremacy. The original SAT wasn't written by Korean Americans, neither was the Constitution. So to me, there's not a whole lot there when you start unpacking it. With testing, what you find is that hours of study time almost exactly predicts your score on the test. I'm sorry?
Who would have thought that?
Yeah, it's a lot of this. I sometimes get gaslit myself. I'm going to be very honest during this interview. I'll debate people and I'll see them. I've talked online, for example, a fair amount with the sociologist Rod Graham, the scholar Matsukitas, some other people. Don't dislike these guys. But when you see these guys in tweed jackets sitting there saying, well, what could it be but racism? You start to think, well, maybe there's something to this. They can't just all be depending on the arguments from 3 or 4 of these, fairly illogical scholars, can they? And very often that does kind of seem to be the case. I mean, like with testing, yes, there's a guy named John Ogbu, African-born, again, quantitative guy, knew what he was talking about, went to Shaker Heights in Ohio, which is a wealthy Cleveland suburb. They actually competed against my high school, East Aurora Senior, in sport during my secondary education, as I recall, preppy school. But it's about half black and half white because there are many rich blacks in the USA. Certainly no shortage of rich Asians and Jewish Americans and so on. But black students at Shaker were doing dramatically worse than white students. And there were also other groups of students, for example, varsity athletes, that were underperforming in that particular school. So this quantitative writer goes to the school and spends a year looking at why this is. And in the end, he writes a well-known, I believe, best-selling book, but almost disgustedly, he says, well, the reason is that the students that are doing badly don't spend a lot of time studying. They tend to be good athletes. They tend to chase girls. It's these big black and white Midwestern guys, and they're just not spending a lot of time in the classroom. I don't know if you need to pay me to do this project again, just, make the athletes go to study table at this school. It's one of the simplest, he's not talking about genetics. He's not talking about racism. He's saying people that get into these cultures, a Southern culture that's shared by many blacks and whites, that high school athletic culture both of us may have participated in, so on down the line. People that do that spend more time screwing around with girls and goofing off at the mall and so on than they do reading books. And when you adjust for that, and he does in one model, if I recall, the difference goes away. You don't need to resort to potentially racist explanations or the criticism of whites or anything like that. You just need to get kids studying. So very often, I think, there's another book where another kind of quantitative center-right guy, John Lott, comes in and does a similar analysis called More Guns, Less Crime. Last sentence here, but he finds that the more cops you have in a neighborhood, sort of tough but not corrupt police officers, and the more armed citizens, the less crime you have. Now, there are downsides, there's domestic violence and so on, but it's, again, just one of those obvious conclusions. Like if you have a cop on the corner and a bunch of guys with guns in their houses, you're not going to have a lot of burglaries in this area. So a lot of this sort of floating stuff, like we may not have detected all of the white supremacy within the testing process, it often just strikes me as nonsense. It's focusing on the 1 or 2% of something that may be caused by this popular variable, while the 99% that's caused by non-studying or father absence or something just goes ignored. So that's a core point I would make against a lot of this.
Okay, so that puts two questions into my head. One is why do people, why then do the rest of us, i.e. people like you, just not turn around and say, well, look, we're done here. If you've had to even redefine your racism to even claim there is any, so that tells me even by your own argument, there ain't any, we're done. Whatever, we can have a talk about it if you want, but it ain't racism. Thank you very much, game over. That's the first one. And the second one is, and by the way, since that's the case, why are we spending 99% of our time on the 2% variable rather than on the 90%? Like, what is driving that? Something, whether there's a conscious agenda or an unconscious phenomenon going on, what is it? Help me. What do you think that is?
Well, first of all, I think that's one of the best phrasings I've heard of one of my theses, which is that it's not that there's no racism. It's not that racism doesn't have a 2 or even a 5% effect on performance or something like that. If you showed me that among black men, I wouldn't doubt it. What the question is, why are we spending 99% of all discussion time on this 2% or 5% of the problem? And when you look at audit studies and you see something like, resumes for X group are 7% more likely to be rejected, but they can apply to a second job. Those literally are the kind of gaps that we're talking about. So why do we do all this? I think that there are two big reasons that come to my mind. One is the absolute academic monoculture that we have right now. So when I mentioned two guys, Rod and Mansa, that I'll debate with, I'm not really criticizing their work. I mean, they're nice guys. I'm saying that it comes within this tradition where everyone agrees with them, where everyone agrees with one another. There was recently, and I'm sure there will be academics that respond and say, no, there are intense fights between Marxists and neo-Marxists in my field. But the reality is that whenever Econ Live or a very serious publication like this breaks down the affiliations of academics, tenured collegiate professors, you find that the disciplines, at least in the social sciences and the humanities, lead between 90 and 98% to the left. As I recall, the latest set of data, in major accredited universities, there were 108 tenured sociologists who were leftists, liberals, or Marxists, and there were 0 who were conservatives or libertarians. So that's part of the reason for this. I mean, it's not even that the paper that finds that there's a 1% difference between how black drivers and white drivers are treated at night or whatever. It's not even that that's wrong. There probably is. We need to drum a couple of cops off the force. The question though is, what's the other 99% of what predicts you getting stopped? Is it being male? Is it driving a red car? Is it having expired tags? I drive a fast car. I'm interested. I mean, like if my white girlfriend's with me or whatever, I'll be 1% less likely to be stopped. That's absolutely fascinating, but that doesn't resolve the question of what to do after going to the bar with my friends or whatever. I mean, we're ignoring the huge block of reality here.
Okay, so then let me just move the question back one layer. Right. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to let you kind of carry on your role. Sure. I want you to say, but then let me just rephrase as, how did we get then to the monoculture that is doing all of this? I mean, I know that's a huge question, and great people like Jonathan Haidt and the Heterodox Academy. I mean, I love all of that work. It's very interesting. But you must have a take on that. What is it?
Well, the short answer, and by the way, every time I do these interviews, I feel compelled to say like random positive shit. Like when I was talking about driving home from bars, like, don't drive while you're drunk, kids. Some of them have gotten quite a lot of circulation. So anyway, disclaimers, behave in a healthy fashion, men and women as well. Anyway, but the point of all this though, when you talk about the academic monoculture, I think that the short answer is that intellectuals have always had a tendency to lean a bit to the left. And I think to some extent, this isn't even necessarily unhealthy. There are exceptions, the Scottish Enlightenment and so on. But I mean, in general, there's an old line, the artist is an upper bourgeois who feels guilty. And that's often very true. I mean, the daughters of rich men have long filled out the art schools and salons and so on. So there's always been at least that 60-40 gap there. What sped that up and, moved into STEM and so on? I think to some extent, post 1960s, many people, if you followed Saul Alinsky's advice or, Horowitz's early advice, so on down the line, very consciously went into academia to try to train the next generation of radicals. And there are books about this from the 90s and so on, illiberal education, tenured radicals they're pretty solid. People that wrote them might have moved a bit to the right sense, but they stand up pretty well as reviews of what was happening in college, in my opinion. And as that happened, you began to see a less tolerant process, simply put. I mean, so whenever academics are surveyed about this, people in most fields, with a few exceptions like economics and ROTC, say it would be very hard to get tenure as a conservative, as someone on the right, as a former soldier, something like that. So I think each generation you've had a lot of radicals moving into the academic hierarchy. And I think you've had them implementing policies that even standard DEI policies would do this, or something like a pronoun use policy at a university that make it very difficult to be hired if you're a mainstream conservative businessman or woman. And this just replicates, it becomes exponential. So, I mean, when I was looking at the data that I just mentioned, I mean, the field that was friendliest to conservatives and libertarians was economics, where they or we were only outnumbered 5-1. The least friendly fields, I believe, were sociology and history, where the edge was 33.5-1. So, I mean, when you look at why so much research gets done that ignores the obvious, it's not that people are crooks. It's not even that they're bad quants. It's that everyone has the same faulty starting assumptions. So, like, to give an obvious example, the black-white gap in likelihood of being shot by the police vanishes entirely if you adjust for the black violent crime rate. There's an annual publication called the BJS in CVS, the US Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey, that breaks down the violent crime rate for all groups. And because we're a younger, more working class, more urban population, and again, most of this gap vanishes if you adjust for those things, by the way, but blacks have a higher crime rate. So if you take the police shooting frequency, we're about 25% of those shot, 13% of the population, and you divide the 25% by 2.4, which is the crime rate difference between us and the general population, you see the gap vanish or reverse. Roland Fryer did this in a few other calculations and found that white suspects were 27% more likely to be shot. So why don't people point that out in major papers on policing? Well, because it's considered iffy within the left-wing social sciences, because you could say the higher crime rate is a result of racism that drives black people to have children at earlier ages. I mean, but if you just say, okay, we're going to leave that aside for now, and this is what anyone on the center left on right would do, and you would do the adjustment, you can say, well, we need to fix the hood, but there's no sign police are targeting black people. There are 2 times as many per capita black criminals, and there are 2 times as many per capita black shooting victims. There's no problem here. many just intelligent people from the think tank or the business world, like Heather McDonald, have done this, and it takes one page. Why don't you see it in academia? Because of the 33.5 to 1. I mean, that's a really relevant problematic factor.
But you could have that 33.5 to 1, and the 33.5, as it were, could still be honest and acknowledge what you've just said, and then go off and do some work about something that actually needs fixing. I mean, it seems to me we're certainly skirting on the edge of insincerity and dishonesty, are we not? Because just, you can't explain this away by saying, well, they're left wing. I know a lot of honest people on the left.
Fair enough. Well, I think when you look at academic work that is on the left, and you notice if you look at, say, Niall Ferguson or Amy Chua or Amy Wax or Glenn Lowry, I mean, John McWhorter, there are a bunch of people that are on kind of the center right that produce a large amount of academic and public intellectual work that I would say is pretty damn disproportionate. And that is to some extent because they're presenting the other 51% of the argument from that kind of 1% space. So when you ask, I mean, why is John on all these podcasts? Why does he keep writing books? Why do his academic articles keep doing pretty well? Well, because he's the only one saying some of that stuff. And there are 50 guys saying the other cliche thing back to him. So people are going to look at the original guy and they're going to ask, well, what does this guy bring to the table? Why do the majority of Americans think like him? Can they all just be deluded maggots? You know, and a lot of people conclude this is what the intellectual dark web is. When it comes to my position on threesomes or marijuana or whether it's better to shoot from outside than drive to the basket, I have pretty conventional city kid attitudes. I am considered conservative because I made a decent amount of money in the business world. I didn't fail. I own a gun because the USA has a very high crime rate. And I have some traditional attitudes about masculinity and how you can make yourself successful. That's it, really. I mean, I don't have a problem with gay people or anything like that. But any of this primitive nonsense, and I don't think Sam Harris, for that matter, Ben Shapiro is running around out there with a pitchfork, you know, looking for people to hunt down. These tend to be, the whole intellectual dark web is urban high IQ people mixed across all races that look at a lot of what's going on in modern upper middle class society, just as we would have with the monarchists in the other direction a couple hundred years ago, and said, wow, these people are idiots. These people are the people that finished behind us in class at the Ivies or the major state universities. I remain unimpressed with them. And I'm not going to start saying insane things. Like, I'm not going to refer to you as bunny self, as a female friend recently asked me to get the hell out of here. Go get another drink. It's just, that's the IDW. It's not rock-ribbed religious right folks. In a way, I respect those people in the Christian and the Muslim world, but view them almost as honorable enemies, like either in politics or perhaps in an actual conflict, I would have to oppose your desire to not educate women or something. I mean, it's a consistent, coherent belief system, but I don't think that's what most of the people opposing wokeness, Chris Rufo, Deborah So, I don't think that's what they think. So anywho, but why do people, so before that rant, there's actually just a simple point here. I think that in the age of wokeness, academic work tends to fall into a couple of categories. One is, I don't generally insult other tenured academics openly, so I'll say this. One is what many people of goodwill would call nonsense. This is where a lot of bell hook sort of stuff, like I'm sitting next to a white man I dream of killing, would fall. I think this is frankly where a lot of people would put Kendi's claim that a gap has to be due to either racism or some kind of very subtle discrimination. Robin DiAngelo, and not to single her out, the entire diversity consulting space, like you have to come to grips with your explicit hatred of Black people to be white, all this stuff. I don't think, I mean, you could go on, you could go back to Derek.
That's insulting to me, by the way. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that because, you know, I didn't, becoming from Britain, I didn't kind of come to the US seeing everything through a racial lens. And now I'm being made to. I wrote an article about it a few years ago called How America Made Me White. And it's like, I'm like, whoa, calm the hell down. You don't know me, which is kind of precisely in times gone by, a legitimate thing that a Black oppressed person could say to a white overlord who's treating him different by virtue of his color. I mean, it's like, I mean, it's just mind-boggling to me that this is even acceptable.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff is explicitly racist. And I mean, very often is across group lines. I mean, the idea is that all whites are bigots, whether they know it or not. And if you actually unpack this, I mean, many critical race theorists would also argue that, for example, Black people are prone to be lower in IQ and more often late. I mean, so people will say things like precision in answering math problems or a desire to be at the meeting on time is a sign of whiteness. we were joking about this at my historically Black college, where I mean, like everyone showed up for a meeting on time in our suits, and someone said, well, a lot of whiteness in the room, and it's all Black guys. It was like us, and I mean, a couple people in the community and so on. I mean, so, but to some extent, first of all, there may be less room for pitying, there may be less room for self-pitying nonsense of this kind at its
I lost you.
exploration. But yeah, many of these claims, whether it's Black people simply can't bring themselves to show up to work on time, or white people are all bigots, you know, Asians have a quiet, submissive culture that continues here in the USA. These are explicitly racist statements. I mean, there's very little difference between this kind of stuff and something a Klansman would say. I mean, you need to recognize your skin color because that's the most important thing about you. But at any rate, I think just clarifying some of this, I think we now see why I put it in the first category, which is just plain nonsense. The second category of research and writing that comes out of woke academia, I think, actually is pretty well done, but just ignores obvious points. So there's a recent piece called A Multi-Level Bayesian Analysis of Police Violence, if I had the title correct. And the guy looks at all these things that predict police violence, does a pretty good job of it, honestly. But he keeps focusing on the fact that there's a 3-to-1 gap between Black and white shooting victims. And at no point does he adjust for the fact that in many of the states he looks at, there's a 3-to-1 gap between Blacks and whites in terms of crime rate. Because again, we're younger, we live in the city, so on down the line. So I think that this second category of scholars, when you say they're being a little dishonest, I don't think intentionally, but maybe kind of, they don't want to take on these tough issues face to face. You know, why get harassed, Amy Wax style? Why get hounded out of your department? You just do the paper, you know what the data indicates, and then you leave it to the conservative responder for the journal to make the point, well, none of this means anything if you adjust for crime rate. So you have two bodies of work here. Like body one is just nonsense in my straight up opinion. Body two, there's nothing wrong with, like there's some good audit studies that find racism, but there's almost always a major gap that lets it be tolerable to the left-wing intelligentsia, if that makes sense. So for example, I recently wrote a piece about the audit studies for the journal Academic Questions. And these are these research projects where you send 5,000 resumes into white businesses, for example, generally half labeled with a quote unquote white name, half labeled with the Black name to measure racial prejudice. Something I found out while I was writing the article is that 38% of all American businesses now, when you look at Asian success, middle-class Black American success, you know, Arabs, the small merchants, Arab Americans, 38% of all businesses now have a minority or female owner. So I wanted to look at the audit studies of minority businesses to see if we were racist. And I found out there were none. None has ever been conducted. I'm actually planning on doing this and seeing if I can get it published anywhere, because there's a Black business directory for my state. It has thousands of listings in it. But so, I mean, this is the kind of thing you find. Someone will do a very good study of racial prejudice, but they'll confine it to the sector where you'll find it among whites. And at some level, people have to know, like, I don't want to go in front of the tenure committee as, you know, controversial scholar X. So that's the answer to your question. Why don't people do this? Because you can still do good research, but within that very narrow arena that's allowed. And then you have a lot of other people that are just kind of free riding. We have extensive affirmative action and legacy programs at colleges. And that's where you get some of the gibberish, some of the stuff that's easily disprovable, that's completely worthless, so on down the line.
My shirt color has changed. I'm a week or so older, and I'm probably not in exactly the same position as I was for the first half of this recording because we had a technical snafu. So we've cut the end off that first part and we're editing the second part in, and it's all hopefully going to work just great. So carrying on from where we left off, Wilfred, last week, I had expressed to you a concern about the capitalizing of the adjective Black, because it struck me as being a decision to kind of self-identify as a separate group, which seemed to be at odds with the whole purpose of improved race relations. But you told me I didn't need to worry about that. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. I think that this is one of these issues that was frankly a non-problem until brought into the spotlight by the constant obnoxious sort of social justice versus alties discussion in modern middle-class life. So in the social sciences, I mean, in the writing tradition in political science, generally recognized ethnic groups are capitalized. So I mean, ADOS or Black American, B-A at the start of those two words, are, as is African American, are terms that very often in a social scientific paper would have been capitalized for some time. And that's not unique to Black people. I mean, Irishmen, Italians would receive similar treatment. You could argue those are continental populations or populations from specific countries. But at the same time, I mean, Hispanic would almost always be capitalized. Latino, those don't refer to one particular group. I mean, that's anyone with some Spanish and some native descent. So, I mean, this was something that I never really even thought about until a couple of years ago. And I mean, if you look back at books from anyone from Andrew Hacker to Dinesh D'Souza in the 90s, you'll see, some discussion of whether or not to do this, and probably 70% of writers doing it. I noticed this again on the horizon when papers like the New York Times started sort of pompously saying, well, we have opted to capitalize the B in Black to illustrate the uniqueness of the African American community or whatever. And I mean, that the discussion strikes me as a bit unnecessary and silly, but I mean, I would say more than 1 in 4 of those papers had already been doing this most of the time, or at least that had been the writing style of many of the columnists and so on for the paper. So, I mean, I don't really think this matters much at all. I think the intense focus on it is sort of a symbol of wokeness. Would, if anything, make me less likely to capitalize, but it's not something that as a writer I spend any time thinking about at all. In general, Blacks, Irishmen, Latins, I mean, those have, he's a Spanish guy, capital S, those have been capitalized the majority of the time in most academic writing I've seen for quite a while. And this, I think, if anything, this is a classic example of kind of the painless woke gesture, where a paper that employs 15 columnists that mostly already do this makes the bold statement, from now on, the words Black and Latin will be written in caps. And there's of course no investment involved in that at all. Even if your journalists weren't doing it, I mean, you're, except perhaps a cent or two more on ink, you're not spending any more money. And in fact, most of them were doing this in the first place. So this is what you see with a lot of this corporate woke bullshit. I mean, Dick's Sporting Goods will get rid of, a couple lines of ammunition or fishing lures that are seen as cruel or something. And I'm sure they lose some money, but it's not, they're not going to stop selling football equipment if you want to look at a sport that actually causes a fair number of human injuries, or boxing equipment. It's always the sort of witty, quick thing that doesn't cost anything that's done in situations like this. But in terms of the actual capitalization practices, those have been discussed, with most people just doing it for decades.
So is it true to say that in the academic sphere in which you work in political science, that you similarly see white with a capital W, and have done for a long time?
Generally, no, because white is not a recognized ethnic group. This is actually another one of these points. So Caucasian is a race. I mean, they're a recognized race. Now, this again is another debate that the woke have brought to the fore. Are there recognized races of human beings? But I think for the majority of people that figure that you can generally distinguish between a Swede, a Nigerian, and a Japanese person, I mean, there are human groupings. So if you're saying Asian or Oriental, that would be capitalized. If you're saying Caucasian or European, that would be capitalized. Negro, which is the Negroid race, is the formal term for the group that includes most West Africans, that would be capitalized. So Caucasian is capitalized, and individual white ethnic groups are capitalized. On almost all of them are. I mean, Greek, even something like Appalachian, which does not refer to a founding national population. White in and of itself is the subject of debate. I would really have no objection to the conservatives saying, well, why don't we capitalize that one too? But the issue is whether there is a particular American white ethnic group that shares certain characteristics. When you describe Black Americans, it wouldn't be hard to come up with traits associated with that group, like all Black Americans descend from ancestors from West Africa. All Black Americans experience racism to some degree, qualify for affirmative action, so on down the line. Ancestors from the South within the past 2 generations. That's where, the boats landed. That's where almost the entire Black community is from. With white Americans, there's a much broader population. I don't reject totally the idea that there's a white American identity. I think clearly if you travel to the UK, or, Ireland or Spain, people will recognize you as an American. But a white American could be anyone from an Arab to, an Irish guy to someone from the Balkans. And I don't think most of those people recognize a shared sense of ethnicity. So in general, white's not capitalized. I wouldn't have any problem capitalizing it. But that's sort of a point that stands alone, because Caucasian is capitalized, Italian is capitalized. So most white Americans traditionally have thought of themselves as something along with or other than white. If you asked a Greek, and I noticed I didn't even think a Greek American, I thought of a Greek guy from Chicago. What are you? What's your identity? After he got through, I'm from 43rd Street or whatever, it would be, well, I'm Greek. I'm from Greek town. My ancestors are from Athens. So, I mean, they have one capital letter already.
Yeah. Well, this goes to maybe a bigger and more substantial question then, which is, are people, let's say, who are capital B Black, that you often find yourself debating, not concerned about the potential danger of their work when they say things like, white privilege? They're starting to give characteristics to all white people, and getting people to me, like me, to start thinking in terms of white, which makes me distinctly uncomfortable, because to me it feels like a step backwards into racial segregation, racial separatism, or whatever. So is there not a danger that there's an increasing racialization of white people by this very discourse?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think the capitalization of the group names, where like a Black guy, an Italian guy, both view that as mildly polite when writing journal articles. That's something that in and itself doesn't matter at all. That's something that had existed in the social sciences for a while. I do think that the publicization of it as something new by major outlets is annoying. It's typical corporate wokeness. And there's really no positive defense of that. But there is a deeper issue here, which is that regardless of what we call each other, isn't this constant focus on race going to, first of all, strengthen all racial group identities, which isn't good. I mean, there's certainly no shortage of racial hostility or occasional hate crime from and against Black communities, Jewish, Asian communities, so on. But isn't it going to specifically create a white racial identity, where people that have mostly thought of themselves as, Italian American, not racist in an interracial relationship, are suddenly forced to think of themselves as white? Yeah. I think that's a very obvious risk that a lot of people, including some of the guys we've talked about, like Chris Rufo, have pointed out. Yeah. The intense focus on whiteness rather than whites as unique individuals, or even members of the traditional ethnic groups that we've associated with whites in urban America, especially in the North, but as white, it does have that potential. I'm kind of rambling here. It's also almost entirely negative, right? So you've got the idea of white privilege, white fragility, the white gaze. So whiteness is to some extent being constructed as the negative antithesis of, the beautiful coalition of POC. So whiteness is non-Blackness or something like that. In reality, I don't think it's very hard at all to say that there are white American cultural traditions from, the game of non-European football shared with Black Americans to, the American dream, the entire idea of, and again, it's hard to separate some of these from American cultural traditions. But, the Big Ten schoolboy culture around sports, fraternities, keg parties, rock and roll music is something I associate with white people as an urban Black guy. So I think there certainly are traditions that are associated with white Americans, many of them shared with Black and Hispanic Americans. I also think there are individual in-group traditions among whites, from St. Patrick's Day to Euro as an element of cuisine. I mean, these are kind of dumb ones, but those are things you associate with different white ethnic groups as an American. But now we're talking about a third thing, which is shared negative identity among white people. And obviously the risk of that is that white people will begin to focus on a shared positive white identity. And that is, you're actually starting to see this. There are books on the alt-right side of the spectrum that have names like White Identity. I believe Jared Taylor dropped that one in 2015. So there now are people that are highly intelligent and that are, in the traditional sense of the term, racist, that are trying to define what it means to be white. What do all these ethnic groups have in common? So yeah, intense focus on race in a multiracial society generally isn't a brilliant idea.
Yeah, I mean, because I feel like this was something I think a line I used in the article how I wrote a few years ago, How America Made Me White. I wasn't conscious of being white, blah, 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 until I came to America, and I'm seeing this discourse, I'm hearing this discourse. I commented, and I'm sure I stole this from somebody, that you can force somebody to play a certain game, but you can't force them to play to lose. And that's the danger here. It's like it seems like, you know, there was that famous interview that Chris Rufo, who you mentioned, did recently, where I think he was asked, well, you know, what does it mean to you to be white? You know, what does it mean to be white? And he said, well, I just don't identify as that. Now, you can only say, well, I don't identify as white. Or you have to say, well, I'm going to play your game, and then I'll start bigging myself up as a white person because I'll play it to win, not to lose. And that just seems, that second move just is got to be a move backwards, in which case you're left with, we as a society need to say to Chris when he gives that first answer, which is, I don't identify as white. Yes, thank God for that. And let's keep it that way. I mean, but that doesn't seem to be what's happening. Am I missing something, or are we obviously going backwards?
I think there are a couple of different levels here. I mean, so at level one of analysis, Chris obviously is someone who's of Western or Southern European descent. So, I mean, I think in terms of a whole bunch of things that implies, from doesn't experience as much racism to does not receive affirmative action to, you know, has ancestors from X region of the world and could be tested to determine this by 23andMe. It's a little silly to deny that Chris is a white in that sense of the term, or that he's Caucasian, or he's however you wanted to, Mediterranean, however you want to describe it. So in terms of a whole bunch of things, from blood donation to, you know, assignment of, there are a bunch of situations where this might be relevant, like assignment of roommates in jail is one that comes to mind if you're talking about ethnic conflict. It would be bizarre in a range of these situations to deny that Chris is of Caucasian extraction. Not that people can't get along beautifully along racial lines in prison, but I mean, just that, so that this is element one, like he obviously is of European descent. So that in that sense, of course, it's fair to call him a white person or something like that. Like I'm a black guy or a mulatto guy. At level two, he also has a European white in-group. So he's Italian, he speaks Italian, he's quite proud of this. And I don't think anyone that advocates for color blindness would deny either of those things. That there are a bunch of situations, hospital in the case of a transfusion, where your ethnic background or your racial background matters. If I wanted someone to translate with an older Italian or Hispanic man that I encountered on a street looking for directions, I would prefer someone that spoke Italian or Spanish, and race would be relevant there. I probably would not assume that an Asian guy spoke Italian or Spanish. But anyway, I think that Chris's point is that with regard to a whole set of characteristics that are assumed to be shared by all people of Caucasian descent, by sort of neo-racists in the political space, he doesn't feel like he is in this broad white group. And I think that's a valid point. I mean, so when you very frequently see people say things, Robin DiAngelo, who interestingly is white, obviously Caucasian, and so on down the line, many people in the diversity training space will say, if you are white, you are privileged. You have very likely come from a middle or upper middle class background. You will be treated well because of your skin. You need to recognize that you secretly are racist as a white person. And I think a lot of white guys who grew up in Pole Town in Detroit, for example, might find themselves thinking, no, I've often been involved in fistfights because of my skin color. It has not served me well. No, I don't come from the upper class. I come from an integrated poor city. You know, no, I don't have a problem with black people. Those school scuffles aside, my wife is black. So I think that a lot of whites feel that they are having these perceived traits tossed at them or lumped onto them that they have no association with. So in that sense, I think it's fair to say, no, I don't associate with white in this whiteness and this magical sense of one shared Euro identity that you've created. So this is one of the reasons this debate is so complex. Like, last sentence here, but I mean, it's stupid to say that someone's not a European Caucasian. Like we can see. I mean, you know what a Nordic guy looks like. Two, it's foolish, and it would be a pity for the country to deny the thing those different traditions have given us. You know, Italian food, the music of that culture, so on. But third, it's absolutely valid for some guy that's Italian American to say, no, I don't fall into this image you're trying to create where I and a German guy and a Frenchman have had the same experiences. Yeah, that's absolutely valid.
Now, you mentioned the word, now hold on. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
You mentioned the word privilege a few times. This is also kind of a surprise to me to discover that I've got all of these privileges because I am white, and that they are privileges. Whereas in times gone by, I think we would have said that those people who do not enjoy what I am being told is a privilege are actually underprivileged or not enjoying fully their rights, which of course was the entire point of the civil rights movement. So to be treated well, let's say in contexts where somebody of another color may not be, there seems to me to be a danger in labeling that privilege, because a privilege is something that you, by definition, don't have a right to. Whereas, wouldn't we do better to say we all have a right to be on the receiving end of good behaviors, of basic tolerance, of, etc. So there seems to be an agenda here to me on the receiving end of this, to be told that what to me was just people behaving decently is now actually a privilege. And because it's a privilege, we're now in the space of, maybe it could be taken away from me to preserve somebody else's right because it's a privilege. I don't feel comfortable with that.
Well, I think that's the language you use there is actually fairly important. So, I mean, the idea of privilege implies kind of unnecessary frivolity. So not so much that you are going to give to those that are lacking, but that you are going to take away from those that currently have. And I think that this is a fairly important transition in civil rights. So the idea of the civil rights movement was, well, these groups of people, Black Americans, and also if you actually look through the civil rights movement, let's not forget many disadvantaged white groups like Jews and indeed Irish Americans, women, Hispanics. So, I mean, America had a large gay people. America had a very large number of second-class citizens until pretty recently, and I suspect most countries did. Women didn't gain the vote in the USA until 1920, which is, of course, 55 years after African-American men did, at least theoretically and often in practice. But I mean, the idea of these civil rights campaigns was, well, if group A, women, doesn't have this thing, we should give the ability to achieve it to group A. That's classic civil rights. You compensate for a gap that you see, or you give to those that don't have. I think that a lot of the modern, the term that comes to my mind is just neo-racist movement, but I mean, the return to segregation, this sort of thing. A lot of modern wokeism, which is based around the idea that any gap between groups in performance is due to racism, generally, that the solution is equity, i.e. proportional reassignment of benefits. A lot of this stuff isn't based so much around giving underperforming people chances as it is from taking away from people that are currently perceived as having too much. So the civil rights movement, the core idea there was, we're going to give everyone a right, an ability like voting. And you're then free. Women make up 50% of the country, Blacks more than 12% of it. You're then free to elect your own candidates. And we'll see how they do. We'll see how everyone competes. This is still pretty much the vision I have. Give everyone, equal armament and chances, and let them go out and compete with one another. If inner city schools are underfunded, which in fact they are not, but if that were to be the case, then give the Black schools a bit more money so they can fairly compete with the white schools. What we're now talking about in terms of Ibram Kendi's ideas, for example, or many CRT equity-based ideas, is a situation where competition hasn't produced total equity. And if you look throughout society, you see that this is the case almost everywhere, in fact. There are almost no competitions, from the NBA draft to the annual admissions process for Harvard, where victory actually breaks down proportionately across all racial and gender and class groups. So the focus of civil rights activism today is in most cases on assigning a certain number of slots to currently underperforming groups, whether they deserve them or not. Basically, that's a blunt but very accurate way of breaking this down. So the idea of white privilege basically implies that white people have certain things because they are undeservingly given them. And the secondary implication there is that a certain percentage of these things should be given to people of color, quote unquote. So you're looking at an idea of positive rights. You have a right at the group level to a certain number of Ivy League admission slots, rather than an idea of negative rights. You will not be stopped from competing. And I think that in general, negative rights are not only more honorable in application, they're also a lot cheaper to bestow. So that I still cling to this I support this older model, as in fact, almost everyone does off of Twitter.
Yeah, so now this reminds me of something that I think you touched on when we spoke before, I should say in the first part of this lengthening discussion we're having, which is that the most successful ethnic/racial groups in the United States are that often people of color, they're immigrant groups of color. And a lot of people know about Asians obviously being successful. We talked, was it briefly, you mentioned Nigerians and similar groups. Now, if that's the case, then us whites who are preserving our privilege, something unearned at the expense of everyone else, we must be quite clever and specific about our racism, right? What's the claim among people that you debate with that talk of the underprivileged, the disadvantages of, I guess we're now saying capital B blacks, with respect to the fact that many people who actually are identifiably black or people of color outperform the whites who are supposedly maintaining unearned privileges at the expense of these people of color? Are we very subtle, very good at distinguishing the people who we're trying to target racially? Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, some people actually do argue that, first of all. I mean, that's what the idea of the model minority myth is. And the claim, certainly if you get into some of the more paranoid pieces on this and Black studies and so on, the claim is really that white people allow certain groups to succeed so they can use those as examples for other groups that they are holding down. Why can't you make it? Many people have argued this, and they're not invariably lunatics, at least on the surface. The reality is a lot simpler. So to break this down, in all seriousness, the CRT claim going from Delgado to Kendi really pretty much is, I don't think I'm exaggerating, that all or almost all group gaps in performance are due to racism. So the classic example of this that Tom Sowell tackled 20 years ago is income. The average Black household makes $44,000, which, by the way, is as much as most midline European countries. I'm not excusing the gap. We're going to talk about it now. But no one in America is brutally oppressed, at least at the group level. But the average white family makes around $64,000, $65,000. So what reason for this could there be but subtle bigotry, perhaps lingering restrictive covenants in housing, the SAT still asking questions about sailboats that prevent us from getting into college? There must be some hidden subtle prejudice that causes this performance difference, or it's something that we don't want to talk about. Genetic inferiority could be at work. Kendi keeps implying this. Like it isn't implied, he says it actually. The only two explanations for this are this subtle racism that my book will help you parse out, or inferiority, deep set failure of some kind on the part of minority communities. In reality, this is almost nonsensical. I don't want to mischaracterize what these people are saying, but the reality is that, as Tom Sowell and June O'Neill and so on have pointed out for decades, I've said this in so many speeches, and I'll keep it very brief, but adjusting for basic things, the most common age for a Black man is 27, for a white man it's 58, closes the large majority of these gaps. We do find, when the best business researchers look, you do find tiny residual gaps that are probably due to racism or sexism. If you look at the gender wage gap, for example, and that's important to take into account. But if you adjust for age, things like region, about 50% of Blacks and 15% of whites live in the South, where wages are lower for everyone. No one stereotypes Southern whites as rich, to say the least. Any one aptitude test score, you don't need to take a battery of exams, but throw SAT score in there, see how your future is predicted, see how that correlates with earnings. That's really about it. Obviously, family structure, is there a father in the home? just adjusting for these things almost entirely closes the black-white income gap. It also, interestingly, closes the white-Asian income gap in the other direction as Caucasian families begin to collapse. Asian families have not. A good example for the rest of us. But so in reality, there's no mystery here. A third paradigm, quantitative culturalism, in my opinion, explains almost all of the variants that we're looking at. So I guess I've kind of summarized the opposing position, really. Like, this is what's actually happening. The argument on at least the hard left is, yes, there's some kind of trickery here. Model minorities are being upheld. The reality, last line of it, the reality is that looking at the differences between whites and successful immigrants is almost exactly like looking at the difference between blacks and whites. If you adjust for things like the number of people in the household or where Asian Americans choose to live, so on, whites begin to catch up. So there's no magic here, just numbers.
Right. So why does the debate continue? Do people say we accept your facts, Wilfred, but somehow we don't accept your deduction therefrom, or we just simply reject your facts? Because it seems that's a pretty open and shut case empirically.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people engage these facts. What they generally do is discuss at different levels of analysis or perceived sophistication. So there's a huge body of literature in the social sciences that attempts to find different kinds of subtle racism. So, I mean, there's the implicit associations test literature. Does clicking on black faces a bit more slowly than white ones, when you see a positive word pop up on a screen, does that indicate racism? There's the stereotype threat literature, which finds that some black kids do perform a few points worse than you'd expect on tests like the SAT and the ACT. Perhaps this predicts, the black-white college attendance gap. There are the audit studies, which find, 7% or so residual bias in sectors like housing. So there's this mass attempt to focus on individual sectors of society and say, look, we've still found racism. There hasn't been a lot of engagement with my point, which has most often been made by economists like Sowell, again, O'Neill, which is just that if you look at the larger scale of society, where affirmative action and minority business also exist, people that have the same qualifications and characteristics perform about equally. I don't see that engaged very often. And this is one of the reasons that bias in academia matters so much. I sometimes feel almost gaslit because I'm a solid researcher, pretty good methodologist, but I'm out there, I'm an associate professor, second of 2 levels. And I sometimes wonder, why is only one of the 11 essays in this journal talking about this and taking this side? Am I somehow wrong? And then I think you look at the composition of academia and you see that it's in the social sciences about 95-5 leftist versus conservative, maybe a little less than that. I mean, the most recent data I've seen on sociology, at top ranked schools, there were 108 Marxist or liberal sociologists and there were 0 conservatives. So, I mean, I think that the composition of academia creates an environment where many people aren't going to look at the other 55% of the debate. You're going to keep focusing over here on, does racism exist? Well, yeah, sure, because both blacks and whites are fallen predatory human beings. But that's a very different question from the one over here. Does racism predict these differences that seem to be very easily predicted by mundane things like age? That's not engaged very much. The one valid point of engagement, I think, and sometimes when for example, I argue a lot with Rod Graham, the sociologist online, I'll actually concede some of this point. But the one valid response is to say, okay, Reilly, you found that black people are more likely to study less and thus get lower standardized test scores, and that this almost totally explains a big chunk of the income gap. Why do you think they study less? Don't you think that might be due to racial conflict with whites in the past? Sure, maybe. But I mean, by this point, when we get into the theoretical 50% possibility of that being true and so on, we're talking about something very different from actual contemporary racism. So, I mean, that is a valid response. But my response to that would be, okay, well, it's 100 years later. Let's start teaching these kids as opposed to looking for bullshit magic forms of racism. And again, I don't think there is a counter to that.
I mean, because the question that you then ask in response to that response to you that you've just described is, okay, yeah, maybe what do we do about it then? And as you said, let's teach these kids something. I mean, if this is the problem we wanted to solve, then communities could, activate themselves right now and start making the shift, right? I mean, the question then becomes, is there anything stopping black folks doing that, or anybody doing that? And then the answer is?
No, that's an excellently phrased question, actually. Is there anything today where there's moderate amount of racism across the Anglosphere, but there's also literal formal affirmative action? Is there anything stopping Black people, or for that matter, Hispanics or poor whites or whatever? I mean, any of these groups, Native Americans, is there a force out there in society, not at the level of your individual community being poor, that's stopping you from success? Hell no, absolutely not. Every elite university and prep school in the country, every Fortune 1000 company, and every business that has more than 50 employees are looking as hard as they can for diversity. So I recognize the point that minorities may be more likely to be poor. That's what a lot of this systemic racism stuff breaks down to. You know, trapped in decaying substandard neighborhoods. Like, coming from Appalachia, it's very hard to take that totally seriously. I guess we're a couple miles from the mountains here. But, you know, there are many decaying substandard neighborhoods around the country. That's a focus of income. That's a focus of SES, social class. But sure, there are more minorities that are low SES today because of oppression and conflict in the past. I don't think anyone who is well-intentioned, anyone who's looking honestly at the facts, would deny that. But if you compare those kids to equal income white kids, is there a major disadvantage? No. And the evidence for this is the fact that, as you mentioned, all of these people come to the USA from majority minority, powerful LDC world countries and outperform both whites and Blacks. The richest group in the USA is East Indians. I mean, so when you talk about Black household incomes, 45,000, white household income, 65,000, East Indian household incomes, 146,000. So I mean, that's it. That's the counter right there.
So in the face of that response from you, those who oppose you, who are concerned to identify all this racism and point out that you know, historical injustice is responsible for this, what do they say about getting on with it? Are they getting on with it? Or not? Are they coming up with reasons not to try, or are they coming up with reasons why they are trying and it's failing? Where are we on that?
Well, I think at the individual level, I mean, when you look at a whole range of sectors from, you know, frankly, athletics and arts and music, dominated by people of color at the moment, but over to quite serious business, a lot of Black MBAs going out in the field these days, education, for good or ill, given how woke it is. But I mean, you know, half of all Black PhDs are concentrated in education. I think at the individual level, a lot of Black people, certainly most Asian, Jewish Americans, so on, are just going out and competing. I think at the structural level, there is a problem. And that is that we are telling people that basically, I mean, cutting through all the crap, we're telling people that the country is racist and evil. I mean, when you look at the most popular educational materials that are assigned in secondary school, I mean, you're talking about Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. You're talking about Nicole Hannah-Jones' The 1619 Project. You're talking about a great deal of what's currently being debated by local school boards, I think title's accurate enough, as critical race theory. And I can't help but feel that if you tell people all of this stuff throughout their formative years, they are going to be a bit less focused. There's probably going to be a tendency to rely on something like affirmative action programs as opposed to going as hard as you can against the test. I mean, there's definitely going to be an idea that entire fields of enterprise, like a lot of STEM, are hostile and closed to you. And a lot of this is based on nonsense to some extent. I mean, if you assume that standardized tests actually are racially biased, and that what the gaps in standardized test performance have to reflect is not study time, but some kind of hidden prejudice, it's going to be very, very hard for you to prepare to go out and do extremely well on that exam, because the idea is that it's the white man's test. It's corrupt. It's evil. What you get doesn't matter. You're playing with the other fellow's cards. So at the individual level, most people of all groups are trying and competing, and African Americans are trying as hard as everybody else. There are some systemic barriers, single motherhood and so on, very few of them set up by the white man. At the structural level, and this is why I said, you know, Asians are going at least as hard with a little more success. There are things like the widespread belief in magic racism that impede performance. That was a little rambly, but I think it's hard to deny that. If you feel everyone out there is against you, especially in a situation where they're not, and if you respond in very predictable ways to that, like by focusing away from what brings success, that's going to have measurable results when you're looking at kind of that big group level.
This reminds me of the Goethe quote that I'm always using when I'm lecturing in political psychology and such things. which is now, Colin, can you hear? Can you? I'm concerned.
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I think there's something playing up here. The Goethe quote that I love so much is "You see only what you know," and if you are, as you say, are living in a paradigm of, I am a victim, then that determines how you interpret many of your experiences. That may not be anything to do with victimization. But it's always going to nudge your interpretation of your experience in a way that reinforces the paradigm, right? So it's kind of filtering your data or affecting the interpretation of your experiential data. So to what extent do you think, Wilfred, that the experiences that a lot of the researchers that you find yourself debating are having are actually the result of what they're already being taught, about how to interpret their lives and their experiences? And to what extent are they genuinely responding to experiences of racism that might, at least we could admit, justify their insistence on spending 99% of their time on 2% of the problem, to use a phrase we used earlier?
Yeah, I think that the environment where this sort of stuff is fed constantly to minorities, blacks, people of color, whatever, definitely plays a big role. And I'll give an empirical quantitative example. A couple of times with groups of people, including, say, method students or students in similar classes, or groups of, say, 20 people I was interacting with online, I've done a really simple exercise that's been used before in political science and psychology, which is where I ask people how many negative experiences they normally have in, say, a month. This would be, at the most extreme, I suppose, a fist fight, but an altercation in traffic, an argument, a domestic dispute, something like that. And then I ask them how many of these negative experiences, an angry glance, they think were due to racism. What I've found is that in a typical working class environment, certainly in most of Kentucky, the actual figure was that blacks and whites experience almost an identical number of negative things, negative interactions. I believe black people were a quarter of an interaction ahead the last time I did this with a group of 20 or 30 people. But African Americans attribute almost half of these, which would be like 15 without having the data in front of me, to racism. So I think there's a measurable element here. Like, obviously that's a crude study outline. I'd like to do this seriously as an academic article. I will, knock on wood. But I mean, that illustrates something quite deep to me, which is that most people, if you're looking at ordinary working class people in Louisville, Kentucky in the year 2021, have very similar lives. But because of this constant flood of messaging about ethnic conflict and race war and so on down the line, most of which is completely just nonsensical, people that are in these minority communities often feel that a lot of what they're experiencing is due to racism, when it's just not. Empirically, there's no way that, group A is at 14, group B is at 14.4, but 8 of group A's experiences were due to race conflict. And I mean, this has been measured by other people. I mean, the political scientist Eric Kaufman, in his most recent piece, actually did sort of similar experiment where he had people read one of 2 8-page or whatever it was passages from a book. And the first one was just from a book of African history that was about the historical performance of civilized black kingdoms. Nothing staggering, but, a high medieval level of competence. The great black kings, they fought the whites. They eventually lost, honors on both sides. So just history. The second one was a passage from, I believe, Ta-Nehisi Coates, talking about African-American failure and struggle and white racism today, and, the brutalization of black bodies. And people were then asked questions like, do you feel you can succeed in life? And do you feel race relations are good? The actual questions might be worded slightly different. But those people that had read the CRT woke passage felt like 20% less able to perform. They actively felt worse because this had been fed to them in this sort of concentrated form. And they sort of maybe hadn't agreed with everything, but kind of processed the thought, maybe these ideas are real. Maybe these experiences I'm having are due to prejudice. So there is some prejudice, but I also think there's an obvious measurable effect of hearing this crap all the time.
And it seems that the measurable effect is greater than the effect of hearing the crap, to use your term, is greater than the measurable effect of prejudice itself. which would suggest that maybe the best thing we could all do to get to the society we want to get to is just let's stop talking about it.
Well, I think that to some extent that is the answer. Again, with total colorblindness, I think it's fairly silly to pretend that people can be absolutely objectively colorblind. If people see a highly attractive Asian woman, they might be tempted to ask that series of questions that follow up after "where are you from?" If people see a 6'2" black guy, they're very likely to assume in our cultural milieu that guy's a decent athlete. That's going to be relevant if you're picking players for basketball or soccer. I mean, if you see someone who seems to be white and upper class, you might teasingly ask them what suburb they're from. I mean, they're obviously behaviors that correlate with different class and race and so on identities as they currently exist. But I do think that what colorblindness means in practice is you're going to treat everyone equally. You're going to follow sort of the current standard of the law, which has banned discrimination since 1964, and you're going to try to shove as little on them as possible. If you see someone that is white, you obviously are going to assume they're of European descent, and some of the things that we just said, they might experience slightly less racism, not benefit from affirmative action, so on. But assuming that their life has been a remarkably privileged one, or assuming that they have a strong feeling of white identity or something like that, it is something that as just a normal, decent person, you should try to avoid as much as possible. And in that sense, colorblindness does make sense. Colorblindness would simply be treating people as neutral fellow citizens until they prove otherwise, kind of. So does that entail not talking about racism at all? I think what it would entail is keeping the laws against racism mostly or entirely in place, and then punishing racism when we actually find it as it is actually really described. I don't think there's much to be gained from truffle hounding for racism where none might exist. You certainly shouldn't, this is, I guess, a fairly important point. You certainly shouldn't teach people that if they see something like an askance look in their direction, that is an act of racism. This is what a lot of modern curricula are doing. They include lines like, never think you imagined it. And the reality is that the data show most of the time you probably did. I can't hear you again.
Any good?
I heard the last word.
Okay. It's strange. Oh, okay.
Now you hear.
Yeah. So what do a lot of your interlocutors say when you simply point out that to say being white is to be privileged is itself a racist statement? Like, what's the answer to that?
I don't think that there are very many coherent answers. I guess you could challenge the claim that is racist and that it doesn't paint whites as inferior. I mean, I'd be interested in debating that. I would usually just say a sweeping or an inaccurate or a prejudiced statement. But one of the things that's really notable here is that there often aren't responses made to a lot of these claims. There actually is a test of privilege that's widely available online. It was designed by, I believe, Ivy League grad students. Could be off, but that was part of discussions I've had about it for the popular website BuzzFeed. It's been taken millions of times, 1 to 100, pretty well organized metric. And if you actually give this quantitative test to people, you can find it by Googling check your privilege BuzzFeed or the names of the people at the top of the masthead there. What you find is that a whole bunch of things predict quote unquote privilege far more than race does. The few times I've done this, I've yet to go through the full 10,000 person post IRB situation, but the few times I've looked at this, about 80% of privilege seems to be just pure social class. I.e., if you're scrolling through a test that includes items like I have never gone to bed hungry, I have had a paid internship, I have never lost a fist fight, things like that. Wealthy kids or wealthy adults, as they proceed, are going to do far better than formerly poor people of whatever race. You find that sex has an influence. Women do still take it on the chin occasionally. You find that being gay, if you're a male, has an influence. Things you'd never expect. Being rural, being from a poor kind of farming county or parish definitely affects how successful you're going to be. so on down the line. But if you point out to someone all of these things have more influence than race, there's no evidence of univariate white privilege, the responses I've usually got are just things like, well, that's one test, or you can't separate race from class. In reality, it's very easy to do that. It's not perfect, but if you're running a regression model, the equation is literally regress race then class. You separate them in the math models. So the response to a lot of this is just to dismiss it, frankly. And I think that's easier because of that 95-5 advantage. I mean, so what you often have in left-wing academia, certainly in the studies fields, is what Peter Boghossian has referred to as idea laundering, where you have a group of people that are fairly friendly with one another and that'll sort of cite one another. So if you come along and just say, as the great quant education researcher John Ogbu did, you know, guys, 80% of this seems to just be based on how much you study. We don't need to talk about genetics or racism, get them to hit the books. The way that'll generally be handled is that a couple articles for the next year will cite, you know, Ogbu's interesting thesis, and then they will list sort of unrelated qualitative pieces and say, but, you know, Dickens and Johnson and Thompson and so on disagree. How seriously should we take this? And then it'll just be kind of lost in the slipstream. So, I mean, the empirical fact that, you know, 80% of privilege is how much money your dad has, there's not a response, but the response is to ignore.
Wilfred, I feel we could keep this going on forever, but I don't want to do that to the rest of your day or the rest of mine. So maybe, I mean, we've actually covered a lot, and I thank you very much for the information you shared, for your insights, and just for this really enjoyable conversation. Maybe we will talk another time, but I think for now, this is fantastic. I see your book, Taboo, behind you. Why not just give it a little plug before we end this?
Well, I keep the book there as the subtle plug. I mean, I've done a fair amount of TV in this particular room. So, I mean, it's definitely you'll see it in the background. And,
I know.
Get some inquiries about it. But in terms of the book, Taboo is a lot of this, although less enjoyably. I mean, I think the book is well written, but not the banter and so on. But is a lot of this conversation broken down in written form. So I take a look at a lot of the major claims that are made in contemporary discursive society, if you will. The Black Lives Matter claim of a near genocidal level of interracial crime, all the way over to the alt-right claim that diverse societies don't work. Does merit immigration work? Looking at Canada and similar cases. Is cultural appropriation real? And I look at what the empirical data say. In some chapters, there's more of that available than there is in others. But in the case of the Black Lives Matter claim, for example, the total number of unarmed Black men killed by, in uniform sworn officers last year was 17. So many of those facts that were very influential for a period of 4 or 5 years turn out simply not to be true. So the book looks at BLM, looks at interracial crime, systemic racism, white privilege, cultural appropriation, non-merit immigration, and the alt-right, and essentially takes down most of these things, saying that doesn't make a ton of logical sense. That argument just does not.
Thank you very much, Wilfred. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, same on my end.
Wonderful, wonderful. I hope to do this again before very long. You have a great rest of the week.
You too. Have a good one.
Bye.